Welcome to the CIL podcast series by the Centre for International Law at the National University of Singapore. You'll find the full range of our audio and video podcast materials at our website cil.nus.edu.sg.
So hello everyone, welcome to this e-sharing session by the CIL Oceans team. Today we have Professor Robert Beckman, head of CIL Ocean Law and Policy, who will be speaking on sovereignty and maritime disputes in the southern part of the South China Sea. He will speak for about 40 minutes and we will have a Q&A session afterwards. So please mute your microphones. If you have questions, please use the raise hand function. And now I will hand over to Professor Robert Beckman. The time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I will attempt to get my slides up. Thank you very much, everyone. I will be going through my slides. It's looking at the extended shelf claims and the sovereignty and maritime disputes. The outline of my presentation, I will first look at the sovereignty disputes and maritime claims prior to the 1982 convention, then look at after the impact of the 1982 convention on sovereignty, on maritime claims, then give the background of the 2009 submissions of Malaysia and Vietnam to the Commission on Limits of the Continental Shelf, reactions of responses of Philippines, China, and Indonesia. Then very briefly summarize the implications of the arbitral award in the South China Sea case. Then looking at the 2019 partial submission and some conclusions. So as I begin, here's a map of the South China Sea. Can you see my cursor when I read here? You got on the east coast, you have Philippines. Down here, you have Malaysia. In between Sabah and Sarawak, you have Brunei. Over to the west, you have Vietnam. And to the north, you have China. And over here is Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei. In addition, down to the south, you see the Natuna Islands belonging to Indonesia. They intrude into the southern part of the South China Sea. Therefore, they also have an interest in this. Now, maritime zones prior to the 1982 convention, there was a territorial sea. The rules were agreed upon, but no agreement on its breadth. Archipelagic states had no right to use straight baselines and claim archipelagic waters. That was rejected in the 58 convention. Continental shelf, of course, had already become customary law, giving the coastal state rights and jurisdiction to explore and exploit the natural resources of the seabed and subsoil on their continental shelf. The natural resources was agreed was mineral resources and living resources of the sedentary species, basically oil, gas, and minerals primarily. But the outer limit of the continental shelf was not clear because of the definition in the 58 convention. Fishing zones, there was no agreement or any consensus on breadth. Coastal states, and at least in one ICJ decision, were declared to have preferential rights, but the other states had historic rights. Some states, particularly Latin America, began to claim exclusive rights, and this was one of the problems that were outstanding. Now, just by the way of background in terms of Southeast Asia, this is what Indonesia had before 1957 with a Duanda claim. All they had was a 3-mile territorial sea around their various islands. It was actually high seas between the islands. 1960, they made a challenge to the international community by declaring straight baselines connecting the outermost points to their outermost islands. This was objected to by some states, but it showed they wanted to declare sovereignty over the waters within their archipelago. Now, continental shelf claims were alive and well. States claimed a continental shelf. Malaysia in 1979, you see my cursor over here by Sabah, they claimed a continental shelf into the South China Sea along with basic base points. In addition, Indonesia and Malaysia entered into continental shelf agreements between the Indonesians, Natuna Islands, and Sarawak over here, but also between peninsular Malaysia and the Anambas Islands over here. So these two agreements between Indonesia and Malaysia go way back to 1969. So claims were being made on continental shelf. Philippines also, 1978 claim. They claimed, again on their maps, they issued an old 1898 treaty, the Spanish-American Treaty. They claimed rights within that rectangular box. No one else recognized this other than the Philippines, but they also in 1978, in the midst of the negotiations for law of the sea, saw the archipelagic concept for states being accepted, so they declared baselines. They did not wait for the 82 Convention to be adopted. In addition, you'll see here the Kalialan claim. This is a claim that they had made in 1978 to a portion or large portion of the islands in the Spratly Islands. That's Freedom Land. Okay, so the sovereignty disputes in the South China Sea. To the north, I'll show you a map again. The Paracel Islands are occupied by China, but they're also claimed in whole by Vietnam and by Taiwan or Chinese Taipei. The Spratly Islands, China, Taiwan, Vietnam claim all of them. Philippines claims those in its Kalialan KIG group. Malaysia claims the islands inside its continental shelf limits, at least some of them. Brunei's claims not clear, but 2 or 3 of the features are within its declared economic zone and continental shelf. The other sovereignty dispute which causes a huge problem between Malaysia and Philippines is the claim of the Philippines to Sabah or North Borneo. Here we have an example here that shows some of this. These are the occupied islands in the South China Sea. It may be difficult to see. Those in red are occupied by China. There's one up here in black, the main island, or the largest, Aituaba or Taiping, is occupied by Chinese Taipei. The ones in purple, a large number are occupied by Vietnam. Down here to the south, within their continental shelf claim, there are several islands occupied by Malaysia. And up here in the Kalialan group, although Philippines claims them all, it only occupies those that are in green. So this shows we have a nightmare. In addition, the little insert here is the Paracel Islands. China occupies at least 6 of those. Here is the North Borneo claim. You see to the map on the, I believe it's my right, I don't know if it's your right or left, the claim to Sabah or North Borneo. There's still an outstanding claim of the Philippines. That makes it exceedingly difficult for the maritime boundaries to be delimited or agreed to between Philippines and Malaysia. And then you have China in the picture going back to the 1947 map of the so-called 11 dash lines, which was issued. 2 of those were in the Gulf of Tonkin, or one in the Gulf of Tonkin and one over here. And this is a map which we'll see that China has used as the basis for its claims in the South China Sea. Okay, now I'm going to take a look in the next part as to the maritime claims after the 1982 convention. What changed? First, archipelagic state concept was accepted. They're permitted to draw, if you're an archipelagic state, you're permitted to draw straight baselines connecting the outermost points of your outermost islands and drying reefs. There was an agreement finally that the breadth of the territorial sea would be 12 nautical miles, and the newest zone giving sovereign rights to all the natural resources out 200 miles, the exclusive economic zone. That's the resources in the water column, the fisheries, as well as seabed and subsoil, go to the coastal state. Continental shelf concept was also included, and it allows a new definition which allows the coastal state, if it has a broad shelf off its coast, to extend their continental shelf rights beyond the limits of their 200-mile economic zone. In the areas beyond national jurisdiction, outside the continental shelf or outside in the water column, outside the 200-mile limit, it's called the area. That's the deep seabed, where the resources are administered by the International Seabed Authority. The other provision which has caused a great deal of consternation around the world is because of the economic zone claim implications on fishing rights and natural resources, there's a definition of islands which didn't exist before. It must be a naturally formed area of land above water at high tide. But then there's a distinction that rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own are not entitled to an economic zone or continental shelf, which means if you have a very small feature that's above water, you only get a 12-mile territorial sea, or arguably another 12 miles of a contiguous zone, but you get no resource rights. This is a map showing all the maritime zones are measured from the baseline, 12-mile territorial sea, a 200-mile economic zone. You get economic zone covers both the shelf resources and the water column. And then if you have a broad shelf, you can extend it out as far as your shelf goes. And we'll look at that a little bit later. And that's called, we call it extended continental shelf. This is what changed for Indonesia. The red lines that you see connecting the outermost points of the islands and drying reefs is their baseline. They then measured 12 miles from this, and the dark blue area is the economic zone claims of the Philippines. Notice that their economic zone claim exceeds far beyond the Tuna Islands up into the South China Sea. Philippines in 2009 amended the legislation on archipelagic baselines because their prior legislation had been challenged by the US and certain other states. What they did was they brought their archipelagic baselines into strict conformity with the provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention. They did not draw straight baselines around any of the Spratly Islands. They simply retained their polygon shape here, in which they're not claiming the waters inside that polygon. They're simply saying the islands that the inside that they have a sovereignty over, and the features are governed by the regime of islands, which means if they're naturally formed above water at high tide, they're entitled to a sovereignty claim. But if they cannot sustain human habitation, they would only get a 12-mile territorial sea. I think everybody except the Filipinos agree that 1898 Treaty of Paris line has no legal effect in terms of law of the sea. Now, 82 Convention on Extended Continental Shelf, which is the topic for today's discussion with that background, allows the coastal states with a broad shelf to extend their shelf beyond 200 miles. They do this by submitting scientific information to a body of scientists created under the convention called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, or CLCS. CLCS then examines the information, makes a recommendation on the establishment of an outer limit. And the CLC rules of procedure provide that in cases where a land or maritime dispute exists, the Commission shall not examine and qualify a submission by any of the states concerned. And that will come back, as you'll see, when challenges were made to the extended continental shelf claims of Southeast Asian countries. But if all the states agree with prior consent, the Commission may proceed. Now, the EEZ claims in the South China Sea. All of the states surrounding the South China Sea, in principle, claimed a 200-mile economic zone after 82, and some didn't wait for the convention. As soon as it was agreed in the conference, they all claimed it already. But none of them issued any maps or lists of coordinates indicating the outer limit of their 200 nautical mile economic zone. And my view is the main problem why they did not list that limit was because of the sovereignty disputes over the Spratly and Paracel Islands. China, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei all claim sovereignty over some of the features, or all. China occupied Paracels, but Vietnam also claimed sovereignty. And none of the states prior to 2009 had clarified whether they intended to claim an economic zone from any of the islands in the South China Sea that they either occupied or claimed sovereignty over. And then, of course, the Philippines had an additional difficulty because of its Saba claim. But the outer limits of the economic zone were not clear, and we didn't know whether anybody was going to claim an economic zone from the islands in the Spratlys. Now, the 209 submissions to the CLCS, I'm going to look at that, and then I'm going to look at the responses of the Philippines, China, and Indonesia to those submissions. Notice these. Now, the CLCS put a deadline of 12 May 2009. Under its rules of procedure, it told states that if you intend to claim an extended shelf, you must submit at least preliminary information by the 12th of May. And I think this prompted the Southeast Asian countries to consider making an extended shelf claim, but it also meant that they would have to define where their 200-mile limit is if they're going to try to claim beyond 200 extended shelf. So 6 days before the deadline, there was a joint submission of Malaysia and Vietnam for an extended shelf in the continent, in the South China Sea, and a separate submission of Malaysia. This is the joint submission of Malaysia and Vietnam. And again, for the first time here, without giving coordinates, both countries indicated the 200 nautical mile limit from their coastlines in red. And what they were saying in their extended is that we jointly claim this, we'll resolve the boundary between us at some future time. It's interesting that the same map, which is in this map, is from the executive summary to their submission, which is available on the UN website. They were also kind enough to indicate where the Philippines' 200-mile economic zone would be, or I guess where they thought the zone design would be. In the executive summary, it stated that the submission was prepared jointly and collectively, that they would make further submissions either jointly or unilaterally in respect of other areas of extended shelf. Said there are no unresolved boundary disputes in the defined area. And in any case, the joint submission will not prejudice matters relating to delimitation of boundaries with opposite or adjacent states. And what's also interesting, they said the two coastal states have undertaken efforts to secure the cooperation of the other relevant states. And it seems clear that they consulted the Philippines, Brunei, and China. Now, Vietnam's separate submission on the same day, 6th of May, indicates the location of the joint. If you look at the cursor, the joint submission is down here. This is Vietnam's indication of where its extended shelf north of that joint submission would be. indicates that also that's 350 miles from their coast, but the outer limit was this orange line here connected by those coordinates. In their separate submission, the Vietnamese said, we wish to inform the Commission there's a common understanding of a shelf which is the subject is of overlapping interest by other relevant states. Vietnam's of the view that it's the subject of this submission is not subject of any overlap and dispute, but in any case, it's without prejudice to the maritime delimitation. They also indicated they had undertaken efforts to secure the non-objection of the other relevant coastal states. So they were saying there is not subject to overlap, but they were also saying we tried to resolve this. Now, this two notes provoked responses by the Philippines and then responses to the Philippines by Vietnam and Malaysia. Philippines, as one might expect, responded by saying the claims of the two states overlap with Philippine territorial claims in the Kalialan group, including North Borneo or Sabah. Vietnam then responded by saying it's without prejudice to the delimitation and sovereignty disputes. And in any case, we have sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, not you and your Kalialan claim. So again, the sovereignty disputes were raised. Malaysia then responded to the Philippines, saying we invited the Philippines to join the submission and we made it without prejudice to delimitation and sovereignty disputes. But again, they also said Malaysia does not recognize the Sabah claim of the Philippines. It's without merit. So the sovereignty issues created difficulties. Here's a good example of that. Preliminary information, interesting, on 12 May, just 6 days later, Brunei did not respond to the submissions, but Brunei made a statement of preliminary information to the CLCS saying they intended to make an extended continental shelf claim. Presumably it would be in this area, which overlaps completely. This is the joint claim of the other two. So the waters were muddied even further with the preliminary statement of Brunei. Now, these statements also created a serious problem for China because it changed the dynamic, at least in my view, of the maritime disputes. Before these submissions, it wasn't clear whether the Southeast Asian countries were going to claim an economic zone from any of the disputed islands. But the CLCS submissions at least implied that they were claiming an economic zone only from their mainland coast, or in the case of the Philippines, perhaps from their archipelagic baselines. So if you look at the map, you see the implications of this. This is the extended shelf claim of the joint submission of Malaysia and Vietnam. Here's the single solution or claim of Vietnam. It means that they were not claiming any economic zone from any of the islands in the Spratlys. They were measuring their economic zone and extended shelf only from the baselines along their coast, or from perhaps this way they assumed the Philippines would also not be claiming from the islands, but would be claiming an economic zone from their coast. This caused a huge dilemma for China because they're way too far north. The practical implications would be almost all the oil and gas and almost all the fisheries would fall within the economic zones or outer continental shelf of the Southeast Asian countries in the southern part of the South China Sea. So China, one day after the joint submission, submitted their note verbal of 7 May, objecting. And the key language here, that China has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. See attached map. And then the map that was attached is now infamous 9-line map. And it was the first time that China had put forward this map in the international community. And it raised a huge amount of consternation in the Southeast Asian countries because rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters and their seabed and subsoil was extremely vague, and it was not clear what they meant. Now, a series of communications as a result of that. China responded one day after the joint submission and the separate submission. Vietnam responded the next day to China. Malaysia then responded to China. Indonesia then responded a year later, or about 14 months later. Philippines came back and responded in 2011. China then made a response to the Philippines, and then Vietnam responded to the Philippine note as well. So these, again, the CLC submissions are very important, the notes verbal, because the notes verbal is an official note by that state to the Secretary General of the United Nations, giving their official position and asking that that note be distributed or to all members of the United Nations. So they're putting official record on, and that's why for the whole international community, and that's why it's interesting to examine them. Now, summarizing these responses, Vietnam responded by saying it had sovereignty over both the Paracels and Spratlys, and therefore China's claim has no legal, historical, or factual basis and is null and void, triggering a major dispute between China and Vietnam. Malaysia didn't respond directly. It just said they made their submission without prejudice to land or maritime disputes, and it had informed China prior to its submission. Indonesia came in a year later by saying that the small and remote features in the South China Sea, in the Spratly Islands, were not islands entitled to an economic zone of their own, and therefore, or any continental shelf, and therefore the 9-line map lacks any international legal basis and is tantamount to upsetting the 82 Convention. Philippines responded by saying it had sovereignty over the KIG Islands in accordance with Article 121 on rocks and islands, and there's no basis for China's statement that it has rights and jurisdiction in the, quote, relevant waters, unquote. So the die was cast and there was a major dispute between China. I just want to show you a map here. This shows why Indonesia, even though they're not a claimant state, no one else claims the Natuna Islands, and it does not claim any of the Spratlys. But the difficulty is when the 9-line map was put up, if you connect the dashes, it overlaps not just with the economic zone claim of Indonesia, but also with their continental shelf claim. And therefore, their fisheries and their oil and gas in this area, it was saying in their note that China, none of these islands is entitled to an economic zone, and therefore you have no basis for challenging us. Now, China came back, responded to the Philippines in April 2011, saying it had indisputable sovereignty over the islands and their adjacent waters. This is supported by historic and legal evidence since the 1930s. The so-called KIG claim was making a claim to part of China's South China Sea islands, and that prior to it only arose in the 70s when the Philippines illegally occupied islands. And then they say the economic and continental shelf claims from coastal territory cannot infringe upon territorial sovereignty of other states. They clearly meant by that the territorial sovereignty they claim over the islands in the South China Sea. And they said China's Nansha Islands, which is the 4 island groups they claim, are fully entitled to territorial sea economic zone continental shelf. This statement suggests they were claiming zones only from the islands. Okay, now, 2000 arbitral award then came in. Remember, these were all 2011. Dispute then rose between Philippines and China, went to arbitration, and 2 of the arguments of China that were dealt with by the court, there are the tribunal. The tribunal led China's claims to any historic rights within the 9-dash line are contrary to the law of the Sea Convention without legal effect. To the extent they each exceed the limits of China's maritime entitlements under UNCLOS, and to the extent they had historic rights to the water, such rights were extinguished by the entry into force of UNCLOS. When they ratified UNCLOS, they in effect gave up those rights. They also ruled in the arbitral tribunal that none of the features or islands in the Spratlys were entitled to an economic zone and continental shelf of their own because all of the largest features were only rocks within Article 121.3. And then the 2 of the features near the Philippines were actually low tide elevations. So the result of the award is that it reduced significantly the disputed maritime areas. The only maritime areas in the southern part that were disputed are the 12-mile territorial sea around the islands. And there are in fact no overlapping EEZ or continental shelf claims between China and the Philippines. This is a map taken from the tribunal's decision. The pink area is the area that China would have claimed within the 9-dash lines. The effect of the tribunal's decisions, they say the only disputed areas are the 12 miles around the so-called islands, or what the court referred to them as high tide features, the features that were above water at high tide. Notice that a lot of the features in the Spratlys are either below water at high tide or they are below the low tide elevations, only above water at low tide. And the main area for oil and gas in the Philippines is the Reed Bank up here, which there are no islands near Reed Bank. So this would, under the tribunal's decision, belong solely within the economic zone of the Philippines. Now we fast forward to 2019. Just 3-4 months ago, a partial submission of Malaysia, which was responded to by the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. Partial submission was submitted to the UN Secretary General to the CLCS on 12 December 2019. The executive summary, well, the date of it is, interestingly, November 2017 on the executive summary itself, which means the Malaysia had prepared it at least 2 years earlier, but had not submitted it for whatever reason, and then they decided to submit it in December of 2019. The partial submissions for the remaining portion of the continental shelf beyond 200-mile limit of its economic zone. And again, they said, as they did with their joint submission with Vietnam, they said it's not located in an area where there's a land or maritime dispute, and that it's there acknowledges that there are potential overlapping entitlements, but submissions made without prejudice to matters relating to delimitation. The executive summary just shows a map with 4 points that are connected. Here's their 200-mile economic zone. The shelf extends out into here. It would be this area down here. This is this is the Philippines. It would be this area in this part. This was analyzed by Professor Thao from Vietnam, the former the member of the International Law Commission from Vietnam. In an article in The Diplomat, he gave possible reasons for the submission in December 2019, saying it prompts the other concerned states to talk to Malaysia about delimiting the areas of overlap. May have been done before the end of the negotiations on the Code of Conduct to avoid any restrictions on submissions that may be in the Code of Conduct. Encourages the CLCS to reconsider the Vietnam-Malaysia joint submission. And he said it overlaps with a portion of the separate submission of Vietnam that was made in 2009, but explains that the divergence and the small overlap can be explained because the two countries use different methods in calculating the outer limits of the extended continental shelf. Now, he has a map that accompanied that article in The Diplomat, and it's this small area right in the middle. This is the Vietnamese claim. This is Malaysia's here, and he said there's a small area of overlap. So that, again, Philippines responded on 6th of March of 2020, and it recalled its note verbal of 2009 with respect to the joint submission of Malaysia and Vietnam, and again made some of the same arguments. The submission covers features in the KIG group, which are under the sovereignty of the Philippines, overlaps with the extended continental shelf of the Philippines that it intends to make, signaling that it intends to make a Outer Continental Shelf Commission submission as well to the CLCS, and it's projected from portions of North Borneo, or the Sabah claim comes in again. So same arguments in effect that the Philippines had, except now they're making it clear they intend to make a submission for an extended shelf. Vietnam's note, Vietnam indicated is responding to the submission, and they actually said they're responding to the submission of Malaysia as well as the response of China, but they did not, in the content of it, they're not saying anything about the separate submission of Malaysia. They're addressing the submission, the response of China. What does that mean? That Vietnam didn't criticize it? Maybe Vietnam believes that there's only a small area of overlap, and when two countries have good relations, they can maybe resolve any overlapping boundary. And it really has no issues. It's consistent with the fact that they made the joint submission together. Vietnam made their partial submission immediately. Malaysia just waited about 11 years to make theirs. But what's interesting is also China made an objection again one day after the same day again, I guess, of the Malaysia's partial submission. Presented on the same day indicates again China must have been warned in advance, or that it was coming, and had their arguments or their protest note or note verbal prepared in advance. China's again submission, slightly different. It's interesting because it shows that China's claim in the South China Sea could be evolving, because this statement now says it has sovereignty over the 4 island groups in the South China Sea, and that the island groups are entitled to all maritime zones, including economic zone and continental shelf. These positions comply with relevant international law, and the submission of Malaysia severely infringed China's sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the South China Sea. So this submission suggests there's been a lot of analysis on this in the literature, that China has, after the decision of the arbiter tribunal shifted its position a little bit in saying we're claiming the groups, implying that they may be able to draw baselines connecting the islands in the group and claim maritime zones from them. And of course, this provoked a response from the Philippines to China. Considers China's positions inconsistent with international law, including UNCLOS, which comprehensively allocates maritime rights. Second, again, that Philippines has sovereignty over the islands in the KIG and Scarborough Shoal, brought up Scarborough Shoal. And maritime entitlements, the Philippines cites the South China Sea Arbitral Award of 2016, pointing out that that award unanimously decided that none of the features in the South China Sea generate entitlements. And they also responded to the island group's argument by saying Spratly Islands cannot be enclosed within a system of strait or archipelagic baselines and accorded an entitlement as a single unit. And then they responded on the issue of historic rights, say this was conclusively settled by the South China Sea decision, claims to historic rights that exceed geographic limits under UNCLOS are without legal effect. And UNCLOS superseded any historic rights or fishing rights, for example, they may have had historically. Vietnam then retook the opportunity, as I said, saying they're responding to both Malaysia and China. They actually only responded to China, saying they violate Vietnam's sovereignty over the Paracels and Spratlys. They said any entitlement to any feature shall be determined in accordance with 121.3, which is rocks cannot sustain human habitation, get no economic zone. And then the baselines cannot be drawn by connecting in other words, the group argument. They said only archipelagic states have a right to draw baselines around mid-ocean archipelagos, and that low tide elevations and submerged features are not capable of ending any entitlements. So again, using the China note as a way to make it clear that they were making arguments that without citing the South China Sea Award were completely consistent with the award in that case. Okay, now almost to the end. There was also reports in the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative that's run out of Washington by CSIS that the West Capella, a drilling vessel under contract of Petronas, the national oil company of Malaysia, was drilling for oil blocks located within the area of the joint submission made by Malaysia and Vietnam in 2009. AMTI further reported the West Capella was challenged by government vessels of both Vietnam and China. No official statements that I've been able to find have been made by any of the governments. If it's correct, it would be inconsistent with its joint submission, Malaysia's joint submission with Vietnam. But there's a lot of ambiguity. There's no official statements. This is the AMTI map. Showed that 2 oil blocks that Malaysia has declared exist within the area of the joint submission of 2009, and that they were drilling here. Now, to the extent there was any communications between Malaysia and Vietnam, it's not clear. It is clear that China came down with Coast Guard vessels to express their concern about this, shall we say. And other than that, I haven't been able to find much on the information except on the web, except for speculation. My conclusions: Malaysia and Vietnam consulted with the Philippines before making their submissions in 2009 with the hope that the Philippines would join the joint submission. Also consulted with China and possibly with Brunei. Philippines not able to agree because the claims overlapped over the areas where it planned to submit a claim for an extended shelf, but also raised problems with respect to both the Kalialan claim and their claim to Sabah. And it'll be therefore very difficult for that boundary between Malaysia and Philippines to be resolved because of the KIG and the Sabah claim until that issue is resolved. Malaysia and Vietnam have no overlapping EEZ or continental shelf boundaries except in that joint area. And arguably, they have better relations and should be able to resolve their problems. I think that area of overlap looks to me like it'd be quite easy to resolve that through negotiation. The partial submission of Malaysia was a surprise, at least in terms of its timing. Motives for making the submission in December 2019 are not clear. It served as a reminder that to the international community that Malaysia has fundamental differences with China and with the Philippines with respect to claims in the South China Sea. China's response again raised the issue of its perhaps island groups, but it also gave Philippines and Vietnam the opportunity to challenge China's revised their position and to cite the arguments from the 2016 arbitral award. Malaysia now, the partial submissions opened up the opportunity between more cooperation between Malaysia and Vietnam in that extended shelf area. The objection by Philippines was expected because of the KIG claim and the claim to Sabah. Thanks for your attention. Happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Bob. I mean, to me, this is a very complex set of issues which I didn't feel I really was even beginning to understand, and you gave a very clear outline and explanation here. I was just wondering, and perhaps Tara, this is something you can also comment on. I mean, under the law of the sea, it seems that China is attempting to make those islands habitable in some way. And I'm just wondering about the status of those efforts. So that's one question. I'm interested in the, I was also interested in the character of the dispute between the Philippines and Malaysia about Sabah, what the historical background to that might be. And I suppose the third question might be something like how China is relating to international law and trying to deal with these issues. So there's a lot of discussion about, you could say, great power approaches to international law, how great powers try to use international law when it favors them, but disregard international law when it doesn't, and how great powers also sometimes try to change the rules themselves. So those are just three questions that emerged from a fascinating and wonderfully clear discussion. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Again, the Article 121.3, which says rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own, was an intentionally vague provision put in the early draft, which they could never reach agreement on any amendment to make it clear, because obviously states had vested interest. If there's a rock, or there's a small feature off your coast that belongs to somebody else, you're obviously going to claim that it cannot sustain. What the tribunal did in this case was to say sustained human habitation means that it must be able to support a small community of people. Its reasoning on this went well beyond perhaps even what the record in the debates at the convention said. said we have to sort of presumption given the large populations in Asia, if there's these small islands that there's no evidence that any small community has ever lived there rather than sought shelter during a storm or during fishing, then there's a presumption that probably it cannot sustain human habitation. Taiwan put forward a long brief to the tribunal, which the tribunal considered, arguing that the largest island, Ituava, had brackish water and had vegetation and that people could live on it, whatever. The tribunal's decision was no. I think other people have argued this issue. It's really a question of they were trying to give coastal states the fisheries resources off their coast. And they were not trying to give a state which happened to own a very tiny feature off somebody else's coast the ability to cut into the economic zone of the coastal state. I always raise the issue, what would the country's position be if France still controlled these islands? Would you say now it can sustain human habitation and there France can draw a big economic zone cutting into our economic zone? No. That's a short answer. But this is the part of the decision that's been criticized the most. And it's really a question of where you sit. I think the general state practice is if we own it, it's an island. If you own it, it's a rock. Probably applies in many cases. The Philippines' claim to North Borneo goes back to the Sultan of Sulu having a treaty with the British East India Company over North Borneo, and the British interpreted that as a transfer of sovereignty. The Sultan of Sulu and his ancestors treated it as, considered it a lease, and Philippine government on occasion has taken that up to say there's never been a transfer of sovereignty and therefore we still have a claim. That makes it exceedingly difficult for that boundary between Philippines and Malaysia to be resolved. The Kali Island Group City make it even more difficult. In terms of China and international law, my personal view is that China made a crucial mistake. At the time that the claims were made to the South China Sea, to the separate claims, economic zone claims made by Malaysia and Vietnam, China had an option there. It could have claimed an economic zone from the largest features that would have created a large area of overlap. And that overlapping claim is not subject to the dispute settlement system. I think what happened, however, China decided it wanted, for negotiation purposes, to go back to its 1947 map and claim not only the 4 island groups within that, but somehow right historic rights with also, I think, giving it maximum position for subsequent negotiations. It then got caught because I think it didn't expect Philippines to bring it to arbitration and get the decision it had. Now, I think it's trying to find a way to adjust its claim, and it's, I think, engaged in lawfare, one could argue, as others have. Does it mean that big powers? Yeah, I think big powers attempt to change the rules to favor them. The difficulty is the Law of the Sea Convention is not exactly malleable. And you have many, many states that would feel that if this rule's changed and you can claim historic rights, for example, then what's to prevent big powers in Europe from claiming their historic fishing rights in what is now economic zones of other countries? And then your whole allocation of resources under the convention goes out the window. That's the fear of many countries. I think I'll stop there on that one.
Bob, thank you for your presentation. Very good and very comprehensive. I have 2 questions. The first question is about the Philippines. President Duterte, on coming to power, decided not to pursue the award of the arbitral tribunal. His administration had said it would put aside the tribunal and focus on win-win relations with China. I was therefore very surprised by the March 2020 submission by the Philippines. Do you see this as a departure by the Duterte administration from its previous policy, and that is now taking the position of the Aquino administration? That's the first question. You want to answer that first?
It looks like it is a departure. I guess I would ask, and maybe our Filipino friends could answer that. It's a question of who drafted the note verbal? Was it done by lawyers in the foreign ministry? To what extent were others involved? One can never know. It might be that if it were left to the traditional bureaucracy, they might still be sympathetic to the position. Or it's at least, maybe you could also interpret it as, we'll put this out there and that will help us in our bargaining position when we want further cooperation. I mean, there's a joint memorandum on so-called joint cooperation in the South China Sea, but I think they've been trying to negotiate the detail for many months, and it hasn't worked out. So I think there are difficulties in the Philippine Constitution and so on. So whether they've backpedaled or whether it's just a signal to China, it is very hard to say. I really can't answer it. I don't have. That's.
Thank you, Bob. Maybe our Filipino friends could clarify this point.
I think it might depend on who you talk to in the Philippines as well. Okay, the next question
is about the implications of these submissions and counter-submission for the ongoing negotiations for the Code of Conduct.
Okay. I haven't thought completely about that, but it could be that some of the states are putting their positions out there publicly, having them distributed to all members of the United Nations, and then at the COC negotiations and say, well, we're on the public record on this issue, and this is our position, which we now can't retract from. I think it will have Vietnam is now chair of ASEAN on COC negotiations. Whether this has any impact, it certainly could on the positions of Philippines and Vietnam. Malaysia is again challenging China, but not doing it directly. They're challenging it by simply saying, well, we're making this claim, but it's without prejudice to the boundary disputes and the sovereignty disputes. So in a sense, all three countries are challenging China's position. What impact that has when they try to reach agreement on the COC, I'm not exactly sure. I've never been very optimistic that the COC will actually do much other than perhaps what the DOC does, but in a little more detail of a little bit of a code of a little bit of joint cooperation and confidence building measures and mechanisms to resolve tensions rather than resolving the underlying issues. There's no way it's going to resolve the underlying disputes that I've raised this afternoon, I think. That's my personal view.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
So thank you, Prof. That was really great discussion, and I really enjoyed it, and I think it was a wonderful start. Well, we look forward to the next session. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and share it with friends. The full range of our audio and video podcasts, as well as our blog, Our research and activities can be found on our website at cil.nus.edu.sg.